I have on this channel already recorded a number of videos introducing Locke's ethics, the ethics of John Locke in the Second Treatise of Government and the letter concerning Toleration. On the Great Texts playlist and on the Philosophers in Their Own Words playlist. Now I'm recording this video for the Great Arguments in Philosophy playlist, and I'm recording it using Zoom, and I'm now going to share with you my screen and use that fancy technology to look at Locke's main arguments from these two books, Letter Concerning Toleration, as I understand the arguments. The main argument of the Second Treatise of Government is simply this: all human beings have reason, and all beings with reason can know God, and all beings who can know God are valuable to God, and all beings who are valuable to God have inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property, and all human beings accordingly have these inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property. And if that's the case, government should protect life, liberty, and property, and so it should, which is the basic purpose of government, the protection of life, liberty, and property. Now, there's a lot more in the Second Treatise of Government. There are interesting analyses of the structure of government, and there's the extended defense of a government operating by consent of the people, and a representational form of government to some extent is necessary, though there may still be room for some. Not an absolute monarchy. Locke is opposing Thomas Hobbes on this point. He's arguing that a government must be representational and by consent of the people. But this is the major argument that is at the foundation of all his political philosophy, all this political philosophy about representational government and so on. At least that's the argument as I understand it. Now, there's some need for interpreting Locke. In fact, if you study the text, you may find that his explicit analysis begins with maybe premise 4 here. Well, also premise 1 is almost explicit. I believe he just alludes to faculties. He doesn't specifically go into reason and free will as those faculties, though I think that's what he has in mind. So again, you have to interpret the text a bit to get the whole argument. I'm laying out the logic that I think is motivating Locke's argument here in a little more detail. Now, as I probably explained in at least one video on the Great Texts playlist, there are reasons he does not go into a whole lot of detail on some of these premises. He might, for example, have said human beings are created in the image of God, as the Bible says, and therefore we are particularly valuable to God. Why doesn't he say that? Well, it's because he wants to give a perspective on human rights and property rights as rooted in God's rights, in God's valuing of human beings, a perspective on this as a foundation for his political philosophy, which is palatable to different religious traditions. Now, I think he actually believes it. It's not just strategy. He actually thinks that his view is correct. That's why he touts his view. But he also has strategic reasons for alluding to the particular human characteristics that make us valuable to God without going into a lot of detail by, for example, saying humans are made in the image of God, which makes us special to God, in any way that would perhaps make his argument not palatable to different religious traditions. He wants his analysis to be sort of generically theistic so that it can be accepted by different religious perspectives. In his day, in his century, in the West, there's a lot of disagreement over Catholicism versus Protestantism and different forms of Protestantism. And although maybe not a lot of people talk about it explicitly, there are deists hanging around too. And there's Jews and there are Muslims, and maybe not so many in Europe, but Locke is well aware of the existence of Islamic civilization. And I think he wants his particular perspective to be acceptable, at least to any form of theism, perhaps including deism as well. And this, I think, is one reason he alludes to human beings as valuable to God, as created by God, and as having particular faculties, but doesn't go into a whole lot of detail because he doesn't want to risk losing any of his audience. But also, I think he thinks what he says is sufficient. He actually believes this. He has some strategic reasons for doing things as he does. That doesn't mean he doesn't think that what he's doing is correct. What he's saying is correct. I think he thinks it is correct. Now, where am I getting this interpretation? What shall I say about this beyond what I've said? I will say that Locke does not go into a whole lot of detail. What he's explicit and emphatic of in the text is probably premise 4 here through the conclusion number 7. These first 3 premises, well, he almost is explicit about reason. He just mentions faculties. Human beings have particular faculties. And I think that must refer to reason, perhaps also free will. I will say something about the second premise here. You can find in Locke, and if I've set up the zoom properly, you should be able to see what I'm seeing. You can find in Locke a particular reference to the idea that reason is what gives us the ability to know God. Here we are in the essay concerning human understanding, Locke's gigantic book on epistemology, which is perhaps an oversimplification of that book. You might find metaphysics and much else besides, plus philosophy of religion. Let's find where that passage was. I believe the key phrase is light enough. If you go to the Gutenberg edition of the text and Control F for light enough, you should find the relevant clause. But to be a little more precise, let's see where we are. We are in this section of the introduction. We are in the introduction to Locke's essay concerning human understanding, section 5. And he says, human beings have light enough to know God. How short soever their knowledge may come of an universal or perfect comprehension of whatsoever is, that is to say, whatever may be the limitations of human knowledge, yet secures their great concernments. That is to say, human knowledge still can make secure these very high priorities, great concernments, these very high human priorities, that they have light enough to lead them to the knowledge of their Maker in the sight of their own duties. Human reason is able to give us knowledge of God. That confirms this principle. And I think that is some support for my interpretation, but you got to be careful if this is to some extent an act of interpretation. Locke is not so explicit on these first 3 principles, these first 3 premises of this argument. Anyway, this is the major argument. Now, let's go to the main argument of the letter concerning toleration as I understand it. No one who has salvation is physically coerced, or no one who has a favor with God, no one who has forgiveness of sins, no one who has a secured, happy afterlife is physically coerced. Because, as Locke says, God honors faith and inward sincerity, not being coerced into professing some point of doctrine that you might not actually agree with. God honors faith and inward sincerity, not physical coercion. No one who has salvation is physically coerced into salvation. Well, no one who has salvation is having salvation by physical coercion. And the government's only power is physical coercion. So the government doesn't have any power to help people get salvation. Oh, and the government should not attempt anything it has no power to do. And so it's futile for the government to try to help you get salvation, and it should not even try. The government should not attempt to help you get salvation. If that's the case, the government should not meddle in religious affairs at all, since getting salvation, getting God's favor, securing the happy afterlife, securing these eternal goods is the point of a religious community. So this government should not meddle in religious affairs. Now, this is the main argument of the letter concerning toleration. And there may be any number of points of analysis that are appropriate, but let's wrap up this video with some haste. Let me briefly point out, here's one possible point of analysis, one possible room to critique one of his premises. The premise that the government's only power is physical coercion is not going to be accepted by every great mind. You can find perspectives in the history of political philosophy that suggest that the government actually can cultivate good character among its citizens by means of law. This is a thing in political philosophy. It is possible to object to some of these premises, but let's look at premise one. It's very important to understand what's going on with premise one here. No one who has salvation has it by physical coercion. Where does this idea come from? I think it is a natural outgrowth of the Reformation idea of justification. Justification means being justified, being right with God. It means having forgiveness of sins. It means being put into a right relationship with God. And in Reformation theology, justification depends on personal faith. And although some of the reformers had more complex relationships with favored other relationships between church and state, the Anabaptist wing of the Reformation, or the Anabaptist movement, the Anabaptist chapter in the history of the Reformation, however we should phrase that, the Anabaptist tradition developed this idea in that direction, drawing from other aspects of New Testament interpretation and so on, stating that salvation is not by physical coercion, and salvation is by faith alone, and the government should not be forcing you into the right religious perspective. You should join the correct church by free will alone. Now, this is one point where I think Locke's analysis can be traced, Locke's ethics can be traced, at least in part, to Reformation theology. And I think he is, if not influenced by the Anabaptists, though he may be, he's at least in some alignment with the Anabaptists on this point. I think he is developing an aspect of their theology, doing it maybe a little bit more philosophically, but there is some correspondence here to Anabaptist theology. Now, I'm going to end the video in a moment. First, let me tell you, if you don't have any idea what I'm talking about when I refer to the Anabaptists, that's fine. Know what you don't know. Here you could learn something about what you don't know. And better yet, I can point you towards knowledge. I can point you to this book, which is a very fine book, Introducing the Anabaptist Tradition, which, although this is not a book concerned directly, if at all, with John Locke, is an important introduction to the backstory of where John Locke appears in the cultural, theological, philosophical history of the world. He is coming after the Anabaptist tradition, and whether or not he's directly influenced by them, though I've noted a few points in the text where there are suggestions of a possible influence of the Anabaptists, some interesting correspondences. At a minimum, he is developing their idea. This book, The Anabaptist Story by William E. Stepp, I highly recommend as an introduction to that particular aspect of the backstory of John Locke, and in particular the backstory of this premise in his major argument in the letter concerning toleration.